Okay.
All right. We're all set. All right. I am delighted to have Dr. Roy Adams as a guest on the SDA Essentials Podcast. Dr. Adams is a pastor, scholar, seminary professor, and former associate editor on the Adventist Review magazine. He is a sought-after speaker, and I'm fortunate that he's agreed to join the program to talk about two topics important to Adventists around the world. We will spend our time talking about the sanctuary doctrine and the nature of Christ, two topics that Dr. Adams has studied intensely. All right, why don't we begin? Dr. Adams, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here with you.
Great. So please share with us a little bit about where you're from and what compelled you to your academic pursuits.
I was born on one of the tiniest inhabited islands on the planet, and it's a part of Grenada that's called Carriacou. Growing up in that little place, I was an Anglican boy, and then to cut a long story, I became a Seventh-day Adventist. When I became a Seventh-day Adventist, it was under great opposition from my father. And in those days, I would spend lots of time on the Sabbath, not going to church just to please him while I was home. I was attending boarding school. And the chief book of my study in those days was the book of Hebrews. I don't know how I came to it. It just fascinated me no end. And there is where my interest in the sanctuary began.
Excellent, excellent. Now, you chose the topic of the sanctuary as the focus of your PhD dissertation. And I guess the book of Hebrews drew you to the subject, but what drew you to tackle that subject for your PhD dissertation?
This is a very interesting question because it was not a straight line. That very fascination with the book of Hebrews created in me a sort of, I don't know how to describe it. It was such a sublime topic that even though when I came to write a dissertation, it occurred to me at first, I shied away from it for a long time because it seemed to be too sublime a topic to sort of desecrate in a dissertation. Eventually, however, I made up my mind that I would tackle it, and I decided that the first thing I needed to do was to get an idea how the doctrine had been conceived in the Adventist Church, get an idea of its historical development and so forth. And this is why the dissertation went in the direction it did. It was a historical theological study combined.
Excellent. Now, at the time you were writing or completing your dissertation, and there just happened to be a significant controversy taking place within the church over aspects of the sanctuary doctrine, and that led to a meeting at Glacier View. And I believe that you may have been in attendance, but my question is, what lessons did you draw from that controversy in terms of handling doctrinal disputes within the church? And I want from you the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, it's a kind of a extended story. Let me see how I can couch it. As you noted, I'm in the midst of my dissertation, and under the system that I always operated with, I wanted to be as objective as I could in pursuing the doctrine of the sanctuary, because there was a lot of talk that Adventists based the doctrine of the sanctuary on the writings of Ellen G. White. So in those days, I banned myself from reading anything in Ellen G. White that had to do with the doctrine of the sanctuary. And I refused to comment on any aspect of the work I was doing. And then came this explosion after that forum meeting with Dr. Desmond Ford at Pacific Union College. And when I listened to the tape, my first reaction was, oh my dear, I mentioned this in one of my books, "Oh, my dear, the doctrine of the sanctuary, our doctrine of the sanctuary is finished."
Right.
And here I am in the midst of a dissertation on it.
Mhm.
It was like a nightmare. And I remember going down to the Ellen G. White Research Center there on the campus of Andrews University and asking Mrs. Jemison, who was the curator, to get me a tape of the meeting there, a transcript of the tape. And you might have read in one of my books where I said I was amazed at the difference in my reaction between listening to the oral presentation of Dr. Ford and reading a transcript of what was actually said. Without any disrespect to Dr. Ford, what I discovered was that there was not much in the presentation, and this encouraged me. But then I was on I was on tenterhooks because of the meeting that had been called by the General Conference to discuss Desmond Ford's views, because a dissertation has to break new grounds. A dissertation, if it is based on faulty evidence, is kind of null and void.
Mhm.
And I finished the dissertation the morning I was leaving for Glacier View. Uh, my typist finished at 3 o'clock that morning, and I was leaving Berrien Springs about 9 o'clock or so for the airport to head for Glacier View. I was in attendance, did make a presentation. As a matter of fact, through my professors, I was given a chance to give the results of my dissertation. But all during the meeting, I was worried that something might be said that would cause me to have to revise the entire work I had just finished before coming. Because remember, in those days before computers, if you made a mistake on page 35, let us say on page 105,
Right.
then the entire thing had to be redone.
Wow.
And that was the nightmare I faced. And so I breathed a great sigh of relief when the meeting was finished and that I'd heard nothing substantial that would cause me to change a single line of the dissertation.
Outstanding.
Now, I think your question included more than that.
Yes,
but you
the
can
question was what lessons did you draw from how to deal with doctrinal disputes within the church? Because I think that meeting has been a source of contention for many within the church and the outcome. So, any lessons learned, that as guiding principles for you going forward from doctrinal disputes and when they arise.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say about the conference is that it was well organized. Um, there were small group meetings in the morning, each group dealing with the identical question. I was in a group of about 10 or 12 thereabouts, and so you had chance to let your views be known. There was somebody in the meeting to record the comments that were being made, and so it was well organized. And then in the afternoon, after lunch, there was a plenary session in which representatives from these small groups would report their findings to the large committee. So that went very well. I thought the structure was very well done. The controversy, you might have heard about it, came because of a particular development involving the president of the General Conference. Mm-hmm. And so the lesson I learned was the lesson of transparency. What happened is Elder Wilson saw the need to select a small committee of his own. That small committee was sort of, we would say, trolling. I don't like the word. All the meetings, and they would come up with their own resolutions to some of the problems we were having. That committee was not as such secret. I think members of that committee spoke during those afternoon plenary sessions. But at the end of the meetings, their report happened to be the one that went into Ministry Magazine, and their findings seem to have taken precedence over the findings of the entire group. In addition to that phenomenon was the fact that PUC, Pacific Union College, wanted immediate word from the conference to know whether they would reassign Des Ford for the coming semester. Remember, we're meeting in August. They wanted word by September. In fact, before September, so they can know what to do. That was one problem that Neil Wilson had to face. That's the president of the General Conference. The desire to give an answer to Pacific Union College. And the second, you might call it the monkey wrench into this whole thing, was that the Australasian Division, that's what it was called at that time, it's today the Pacific Division, the South Pacific Division. The Australasian Division had announced ahead of the meetings, pastors' conferences and other conferences, where they would report on the findings of the committee, the Sanctuary Review Committee. And the intention was to have a definitive decision at that time to announce to those meetings, which also forced the hand of Neil Wilson. So that very shortly after the meeting was over, before delegates can get home, a decision was taken, I hope my history is correct, to defrock Desmond Ford, so that delegates to the session or to the committee were hearing this news as they arrived back home, and they felt that they were used. And so I think that this is what brought the problem, and the confusion and the bad feeling in regard to those meetings. It was a lack of transparency, and it was because of these pressures that were bearing down on the president of the General Conference, as he and his advisors sought to make immediate decisions on something that should have taken just a little more time for the dust to settle.
So it sounds like you're saying that there was healthy dialogue over the sanctuary doctrine at the meetings.
Absolutely.
And then following the meetings, sort of the need for clarity and direction sort of trumped the dialogue that took place at the meetings.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, the ultimate result, I think, would have been the same, but it would have been a more gradual, a more passionate, a more sympathetic approach to the entire issue. As it turned out, it appeared to be hurried and hasty, and that's part of the problem.
So it sounds like one real lesson that you're sharing with us is the need for patience, when there's doctrinal disputes, and
patience and deliberation, yes,
and transparency.
Transparency.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. So let's look more carefully at your dissertation. What was the focus of your dissertation in terms of the sanctuary?
The focus was to understand where we had been, the journey that this doctrine had taken in the church. And as you might know, a lot of stuff has been written on the doctrine of the sanctuary. I mean, just loads of stuff. So as I came to the dissertation, I realized I couldn't tackle the entire corpus of Adventist writings on this topic. So what I did was to select three prominent leaders, three prominent thinkers, three prominent thought leaders in the church, and focus on these three and see how the doctrine of the sanctuary manifested itself in their writings, in their preaching, in their theology. And the three that I selected were Uriah Smith, a fellow by the name of Albion Fox Ballinger, and Million Loritz Andreasen. These three I selected, and as I said, it was a historical theological study. It was there was a lot of massaging of the topic. I don't think I've mentioned this in any of my books, but there was something very disheartening that happened as I approached the topic. I remember, well, several things. First of all, the first manuscript I was doing was being typed by a fellow student to save funds, and she lost the manuscript
Oh
and
my.
couldn't find it. After I had done months of work on this, so I had to begin from scratch. And second, I came up now, beginning from scratch, I came up with a whole document. I mean, something like 200 pages or so. My advisors read this and they said, look, Roy, we appreciate the work you've done, but it's all descriptive stuff here, and it wouldn't fly. So I had to go back to the drawing board a third time. And I can't thank God enough for going back to the drawing board a third time, because that helped me to focus on the theme, on the subject, in a way that I would not otherwise have. And so it was not simply descriptive, it was analytic, and it was not only historical, it was theological. And I remember reading the book, the dissertation. By the way, it was printed in the Andrews University dissertation series.
Right.
It was the first one that was printed. And I remember after about a year or so, perhaps longer, I went back reading the book because some pastors here in the Washington area wanted me to talk about the book. And I began reading to see what I had said. And as I read, I said to myself, you wrote that? I couldn't believe the kind of writing I had done. And I couldn't believe the facts and the information that was in there. One of my teachers said that when you write a dissertation, at the end of that, you are the most knowledgeable on the subject. And with the passage of time, you begin to forget and forget and forget. And you don't arrive again at that pinnacle where you were as you wrote the dissertation. Wow. So it was a joy as I look back upon the work now. And I thank God for his guidance.
So let me ask you this. What was one thing that you uncovered in doing your research and writing the dissertation that about the sanctuary doctrine that really surprised you?
It was not something I would say about the sanctuary doctrine itself, but remembering, let me just back up. Before I wrote the dissertation I did, I was going to tackle the subject from a different angle, from the angle of the opposition in not only in the church but outside of the church to the doctrine. So I had read loads of stuff from Adventists and non-Adventists alike in opposition to the teaching of the sanctuary. And so my big surprise, as I came toward the end of the dissertation, was how quickly, in spite of the opposition, how quickly the doctrine took roots in the church, so that Uriah Smith, in his time, was already used in the doctrine as a as a support for other doctrines. He was using the doctrine to for example, talk about the imminence of the second coming of Christ. He would go back to the Day of Atonement, for example, in ancient Israel, and note that the services in the holy place took, let us say, 359 days. I think we're dealing with a 360-day year here for the sake of illustration. So the services in the holy place taking 359 days, and the service in the most holy place on the Day of Atonement taking 1 day. And so by some sort of mental calculation, he used that to show the imminence of the coming.
Oh, okay.
So
Using the year-day principle.
Yes. Since the antitypical Day of Atonement began in 1844, just compare that to the time that has passed, and it has to be just around the corner. And then again, Andreasen began to use the doctrine in his time to support his theory or his view on righteousness by faith, and his views on perfection.
Mhm.
So in other words, they were taking, the sanctuary for them was so solid that they were taking it for granted and using it for the furtherance of other doctrines of the church. That surprised me.
Okay. And tell me about the third person that you wrote about. It's Albion Fox, that you studied his views. Why did you select him?
Um, Albion Fox Ballinger, and I ran into his name as I was researching for the sanctuary itself. I didn't know the guy before.
Right.
And I found him very colorful,
Mhm.
and that he was saying things about the sanctuary that was unorthodox. He was an evangelist,
Mhm.
pastor, evangelist. He worked in the United Kingdom and then in the United States. And I thought that this would be a good contrast to Andreasen, to Uriah Smith and Andreasen. And he was making some points, although they were a pain in the side of the brethren, quote unquote. Nevertheless, some of them had validity to them, and I wanted to use him to explore those aspects of the sanctuary. For example, Adventists traditionally believe that the sanctuary is defiled when a penitent sinner went to the tabernacle, confessed his sins with his hands on the head of the animal victim, transferring symbolically the sins to the sanctuary. Ballinger took the view that the sins of all people, not just penitent people, not just God's people, the sins of all people defile the sanctuary. And I found that to be correct.
Right.
And I developed that not so much in the dissertation, but in the book I wrote afterwards.
Okay.
That was absolutely correct. And um, he also took the view that when Jesus ascended to heaven, he did not go into a section called the holy place
Mhm.
to transfer after 1900 years into another one called the most holy place,
Mhm.
but he went into the presence of God. That I found to be also correct, and also presented it in a subsequent book that I wrote. It's also in the dissertation in my critique and evaluation of the three figures.
Okay. Excellent. So you mentioned a subsequent book that you wrote after completing your dissertation. Why did you write that book? What were you trying to present to the church in that book?
Mm-hmm. When I finished the dissertation, and it was very well received there were 6 members on my dissertation review committee. One was a professor from the University of Southern California, I believe it was, Professor Garsted. 5 of the 6 were very pleased with the dissertation. There was one whose name I would not mention here, who was a very conservative Adventist who was not pleased with several things. But the dissertation was very well received, and Southern Publishing Association, it was still in existence then, they asked me to popularize the dissertation for general use in the church, and I agreed to do that. But I immediately, after Glacier View, I immediately went out to overseas assignment in Asia to teach theology there. And as a new professor, I was just one lesson ahead of the students, I have to confess. I mean, just one lesson ahead.
Right.
And things like popularizing a dissertation I had already read was secondary to me. So the time passed and I lost interest in it. And I thought, how could I spend all this time popularizing something I'd spent so much time working on? While I was working on the dissertation, I collected loads of material that were not relevant to the work. And so I was using these in my teaching and presentations. And this material, I now thought, needed to see the light of day beyond beyond the classroom.
Sure.
And this is how that second book of the sanctuary came to be written. It was not an easy book to write, and the fact that it exists as a book that was printed by one of our publishing houses is a mystery to me, a miracle to me. I have written somewhere, I think, about the responses I received from the reading committee.
Sure.
The one person saying, is Roy Adams ready to go to his own glacier view, this time with him as the one at the center of attention? So, as a pastor in the church, as a minister, as a worker, when you get responses like that before the book is printed,
Right.
you take them seriously. I mean, I shuddered in my boots to think, well, what my future might be. But fortunately, the majority of the reading committee accepted the book for publication, and so it is out today.
And I should mention the name of the book. It's The Sanctuary, Understanding the Heart of Adventist Theology, and it is still available online. I read the book. I know you'll be modest, but I've got to tell you, it's one of the best books I have read on the sanctuary, and I think it has withstood the test of time.
Well, thank you.
So just wanted you to be aware of that.
Unfortunately, the book is out of print.
Okay.
I saw a copy online the other day for $183, I think it was.
Okay.
The book is, I have the copyright, and the book can be published on demand. If I receive, for example, more than 20 requests, requests for an order for 20 or more, then I can go through the trouble of having the book reprinted for that purpose.
Awesome. Well, that's good to know. Now, in reading that book, you one of the cautions that I took from you is that you cautioned the reader about a rigid literalism between the sanctuary in heaven and the tabernacle on earth. Now, why did you issue that caution?
As I did my theological work in college, seminary, one of the things I was impressed with was the apologists. The apologists were those Christian leaders and thinkers who devoted themselves in defending the Christian faith. The word is counterintuitive for those who understand apology as saying I'm sorry. In this case, the apologetics is the defense of the faith. Right. And if you have to defend the faith, you want to make sure that you weed out inconsequential aspects of what you're defending. And to me, the matter of a divided heavenly sanctuary, the literalistic understanding of it, while it is harmless, as far as I know theologically, and while I agree with our pioneers, the way they handled it, after all, they were beginning, this thing was beginning. They were at the inception stage of this doctrine. But today, it seems to me that we ought to think more carefully about what we are defending. I remember after I'd finished a lecture at our university in South Korea, I remember a young Korean student, a young woman, as a matter of fact, who was just auditing the class, confronting me afterwards and saying, why do we believe in holy place and most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary? And her question as a young person just got to me, and it occurred to me that this is not a hill to die on. And so I began to, in my book, that second one, I began to look at this matter of what pattern means. And I couldn't get into all the details, but the long and short of it is that pattern in the text is not referring to physical pattern.
Mhm.
It's referring to theological pattern.
Okay.
You can see that in the fact that the wilderness tabernacle was quite different from Solomon's temple.
Right.
Two different structures, both built according to the pattern. And also there were other ancient tabernacles that were very similar to the Hebrew temple.
Mhm.
One of the things I found that was absolutely essential to every iteration of the temple, either with the tabernacle or temple, was the tripartite nature of it. The outer court, holy place, most holy place. And one of my books, I make the point that that has theological significance. And it signifies the death of Christ in the court, which represents the outer court, which is this earth. It signifies his intercessory work, the holy place work in the Old Testament symbolizes his intercessory work in the heavenly sanctuary, and the Day of Atonement symbolizes the phase of judgment that is a part of the entire intercessory work of Jesus Christ in the heavenly sanctuary. When you think of who God is, when you think of the bigness of God, when you think of the size of the universe, and the one who is in charge of all of this, I mean, it looks petty to begin to talk about a veil separating a holy place from a most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary. And so my feeling is, let's focus on the essence.
The meaning.
People want to argue with us, let them argue with us on the essence, not the peripherals, not the incidentals. That to me is an incidental.
I hear you. One of the things that from Daniel 7 that really struck me about whatever the temple in heaven resembles, the suggestion that there are 10,000 times 10,000.
Yes.
It is something that it seems to me, and we need to avoid the literalism, that we cannot comprehend the size.
Yeah.
If there are that many beings, in the temple with God at any one point in time.
Yeah, I try to be very liberal with people who hold a different view from mine on this. In other words, a person can say, well, there are lots of angels there, 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands, but that just means that the most holy place is that much bigger. So they can make that argument.
Right.
But I think all of us are struggling to understand celestial things.
Right.
I'm sure that you have a concept of God when you pray, some kind of a vague concept, but none of us knows what God actually looks like. Right. We were made in his image, weren't we?
Yes.
But we certainly wouldn't use ourselves to describe what God is like.
Right.
And so the earthly sanctuary was made in the image of the heavenly sanctuary. We certainly would not use that to describe what the heavenly is like. In my own reflections, as I think of the heavenly sanctuary, I'm not thinking of a building as such, because I can't understand that. I'm thinking of God's throne. The mercy seat represents the throne of God. And so when I think of the heavenly sanctuary, I think of the place where God is. And even that, gives me trouble, the place where God is. I mean, God is so huge, God is so big, but in my little mind, I have to have something to focus on. So I focus on God, on his throne in heaven, and that is the sanctuary. That is the sanctuary.
Now, two more quick questions. Well, I don't know if they'll be quick on the sanctuary before we shift to the nature of Christ. The main critique, I think, of the sanctuary doctrine is that it destroys the assurance of salvation. How do you respond to that criticism?
Right now, I'm writing again a few things on the sanctuary. I don't know if they would ever see the light of day, but it's in reaction to questions of this kind. A couple of Decembers ago, the president of one of one of our unions, pardon me, here in the United States, sent me and others a video of a Texas preacher who is lambasting Adventists on the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. And he zeroes in on the investigative judgment. Mm-hmm. And he says this is a prostitution of the gospel. Mm-hmm. I've heard this criticism again and again and again before writing the dissertation. That was the criticism. And so, as you would know from reading that book on the sanctuary I wrote, I focused on the word investigative. Mm-hmm. And I think just this morning I was looking at a footnote in the book, and I thought I was more generous then than I am now, because I thought then we may not need to get rid of the word altogether, right. But let's just downgrade its use. Mm-hmm. This morning I'm saying I wish we can get rid of the word altogether. Mm-hmm. Ellen G. White used the word. All our pioneers used the word. But in my study, I was looking to see how the word got into the Adventist church. And I don't think I've found the complete answer yet, because it was back in 1857 in January that somebody wrote a letter to the Adventist, to the Review and Herald, as it was called then. In that letter, they mentioned the word investigative judgment. And at the end of the month, 3 weeks later, Uriah Smith is using it in an editorial. So the impression I get is that the first impression I got was that the word just stumbled into the church. But if the word stumbled into the church through that letter to the editor, how could the editor be using it in such a matter-of-fact way 3 weeks later? So it might be the word has an earlier beginning, which I have not yet found out. But at any rate, Uriah Smith at one point said he'd be glad to use another word if we could find one. Evidently, he didn't like the word, but no one was able to find another one. And the Lord did not see fit to give a vision to Ellen G. White that to come up with another word. But the word has caused so much headache that I think we need to take a step back and ask, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to say? And the conclusion I come to is that what we're trying to do, what we're trying to say, we're talking about judgment here. And we're talking about pre-Advent judgment. So why don't we just use this word, pre-Advent, that has already gained ground to an extent in the church, and dispense with the word investigative? If we can do that, people are forced to confront us on the root of the issue, and that is judgment. And the only thing to discuss would be the pre-Adventness of it. And I think we can make that case very easily from Scripture, the pre-Adventness of this judgment, without getting people into criticizing us for suggesting that God is like a cloak and dagger investigator watching us night and day and things like that. It's not the impression our pioneers wanted to leave. I hope not. And it's not the impression that we want to leave in the minds of people today. Adventists should lead the world in terms of assurance of salvation. And when we understand the sanctuary better, we can see that it is an assurance booster for every single child of God.
Amen. Now, one final question on the sanctuary. We have witnessed over the last year or so, a number of protests over, systemic racism and in particular police brutality. It seems that within each of us is a sense of justice. There is a cry for someone to bring about justice. Is that really at the heart and center of the Adventist teaching on judgment, that ultimately God will bring about justice for his people and vindicate them?
I couldn't say it better than you asked it in the question. This is absolutely critical. And in these writings I'm doing right now, it's as though you saw them and your question was based on them. Because one chapter, I hate to talk about something that is so far from complete, but one chapter would be the cry for justice and the answer from the heavenly sanctuary. Because I have not tackled that subject full blown yet. And this, I think, is essential. When we look at the three angels' message, the first, an angel appears in mid heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to whom? To every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. The gospel goes to them because each one is important in the eyes of God. Each one. If Seventh-day Adventists, based on those three messages alone, would really take time to understand its essence, we would lead the world in terms of racial harmony. We would not have to be dragged kicking and screaming in compliance of Supreme Court order. We would have been the leaders and not the followers in this respect. And God's throne, God sits on his throne, and somewhere in the Bible it calls that the habitation of justice. If you read Isaiah 58 and 59, it's anchored in justice. When Adventists talk about overcoming sin, we usually think of personal things. You can even name on two fingers the sins that they have in mind. They don't usually have injustice in mind, but that is part and parcel. It is central to biblical teaching in the prophets, in the Old Testament prophets. And it is a central theme of the sanctuary. And I hope I can make that more explicit if this ever comes to light.
Well, I am just going to encourage you to finish that book. You whetted my appetite, and I'm looking forward to it very much. Moving on, you have not been shy about wading into controversial topics in the Adventist Church. You wrote another book. The topic of that book is the nature of Christ. And this issue seems to be at the heart of all our internal debates about salvation. What prompted you to write this book?
The book was written in can't remember the year now it was written, but in the 1990s, there was a lot of agitation over this matter of righteousness by faith. It was the heyday of our firm foundation, for example, and the belief was that the reason for the delay in the parousia, the reason for the delay in the second advent, was because the Adventist Church had not come to a place of sinless perfection. And so I began getting questions about it. Every camp meeting I went to, every presentation I gave here in the United States, across the country, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Japan, wherever I would go to speak, you can be sure that somebody would come up with a question on perfectionism. And so I think I was traveling in Ecuador when, during the question period, and in the question period with translation, you're listening to what the question was. So this person asked the question in Spanish, I'm listening to the translation, and that's the question again down there in Ecuador. And I said, you've always been right, you've always been answering questions on this on the run. Why not sit down and put your thoughts together on this? And this is what I did. And this is how it came to be written. I wanted to have a connected thought for my own sake of the entire spectrum of righteousness by faith and perfection.
Now, it seems as if the controversy can be traced all the way back to the messages of two leaders in the church, Alonzo Jones and E.J. Wagner. What can you tell us about these men with respect to what they taught in the 1888 General Conference and the reception of those messages by Ellen G. White and the church?
Apart from these three, from these two, A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner, there was also D.T. Bordeaux. So there's a third fellow in there. Mm-hmm. And these men, so far as the 1888 meeting was concerned, it was just those two, A.T. Jones and Wagner. They brought a message of righteousness by faith. Remember, as the Adventist Church came into being, one of their chief concerns was to struggle against antinomianism. The other churches were criticizing them as legalists, but they had to double down on the Sabbath because they wanted to get that message across. So they doubled down on the law to the extent that they had come, as Ellen G. White said somewhere, they had become as dry as the proverbial hills of Gilboa. So in 1888, as they met, Jones and Wagner brought messages of righteousness by faith. They exalted the righteousness of Jesus Christ. They brought the New Testament message that we are saved only by faith in Jesus Christ. Ellen G. White liked that message. She supported the message. She defended these messengers against people like Uriah Smith, even, and other leaders who were a little more reticent. Even today, you can find this reticence. In every Sabbath school quarterly I go through, you can find this fear that somehow if you emphasize righteousness by faith too much, you would downgrade the law. And again and again and again, we would come back to say, well, but this does not mean that the law, we don't have to say that. I'm so secure in my understanding of the importance of the law that I don't have to say this at every turn. In an evangelistic meeting, I can preach 5 messages on righteousness by faith before getting to the law. I am not afraid that the law is going to be dispensed with. It is a matter of fact. It is so obvious. It is so obvious that, in fact, I'm kind of digressing here. It is so obvious that I've lost the arguments that I would make to evangelicals because I feel that position is so silly that I've lost. It's like when we were in school, we learned the proofs that the earth is round. Right. And you leave school and afterwards you forget those proofs, right, because it is so obvious the earth is round or spherical. So it's the same way. What was your question again?
So part of the question was, what was E.G. White's reaction to what these men had to share, and you responded to that. Yes. Let me just direct you to the 1950s. I think that was another flashpoint when this issue really kind of exploded in the church because some of our leaders met with evangelicals to sort of highlight the doctrines of the church, and there was a book that came out, Questions on Doctrines, and the way it presented Christ's nature raised some objections from leaders. And so can you talk a little bit about that and how that sort of instigated this issue further? Right.
The instigator of those meetings was a fellow by the name of Walter Martin. Mm-hmm. He was an evangelical pastor and a student at a university, and was doing a dissertation on non-Christian religions in the United States. Would you imagine? And I think he was including Adventists in the group, it would seem. Right. But he, to his credit, he wanted to find out more about Seventh-day Adventists. Mm-hmm. So in company with a couple other evangelicals, they approached Adventists and they wanted to know what we believe. So in a series of meetings, people like L.E. Froome, Leroy Edwin Froome was a member of that group. W.E. Reed from the Adventist side and T.E. Unruh was a member of that group, and then later Roy Allen Anderson. So there were four of them who met with these evangelicals for a period of a year. They would meet there in Tacoma Park. And at the end of that, they felt they would put in print the answers they had given to these evangelicals so that they can reach a wider Adventist public and the general public, as a matter of fact. And this is how questions on doctrine came to be. Now, we mentioned Jones and Waggoner a while ago. The Ellen G. White agreed with what they said, but what they said was not written down. So we do not know exactly what Ellen G. White agreed to. But they continued their ministry after 1888. And many of the things they said, we believe, would not have met with the endorsement of Ellen G. White. Because in this area of perfectionism, they went to town on that. And Andreasen, M.L. Andreasen, came and was greatly influenced by A.T. Jones. In fact, they spent time together on a lake there in Battle Creek one summer. So Andreasen, who by this time in 1955, I think it was, when the evangelicals came, 55, 56, Andreasen by this time had retired. And so he was not invited to these conversations, and he took umbrage at that. And he took double umbrage when the book Questions on Doctrines came out, because of a statement on page 383, I believe, where the authors describe Christ as holy, harmless, separate from sinners, exempt from the passions that afflict the rest of us. That sent Andreasen crazy, and it brought a great amount of turmoil in the church that lasts until today.
So let me ask you this. Let's get to the heart of the matter, because I'm mindful of our time together. Did Jesus have an advantage over us when it comes to temptations and overcoming sin?
A short answer would be no. Okay. On the contrary, he had a disadvantage. Mm-hmm. Because remember that Jesus came as a spotless one, and he could have sinned, he could have fallen. And I remember my wife and I were reading The Desire of Ages for our family devotion a couple of years ago. And when we came to Jesus' early life, I just trembled in my seat as we read, realizing the danger to which he was exposed. You and I, what do we do if we sin? We flee to God for forgiveness. Had Jesus fallen in any particular, the game was over. And just imagine then having to live with that kind of attention day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, for 33 and a half years. He had a tremendous disadvantage, but he relied on his Father. He depended on God. He put his whole being in the arms of his Father, and God protected him. If you buy a new car, those of us who have ever bought a new car, we remember how we parked that car away from other vehicles for the first month or so. We didn't want a single dent, a single scratch. But the time went on, and then there was a little scratch, and then there was a little scratch over there, and we began parking our car in the middle of all the rest because it had dents and scratches. Jesus, as a new vehicle, had to go through his entire life without a scratch, and that was tension-packed. He did not have it easy. He was at a disadvantage, not at an advantage. But the whole question of advantage and disadvantage begs the question, why are we discussing this? Why did the right wing go there? They went there because they believed that Jesus Christ was not only an example, but he was a model for us, and that sinlessness that he had, we must also get to that place. This is why they wanted to show that he had no advantage, that he had no advantage over us.
Right.
I'm getting myself mixed up in the advantage and disadvantage.
Right.
And they wanted to show that we are on even par, and so we can do exactly what he did.
Right.
No, Jesus was an example for us, but we needed more. What we needed more was a savior, not an example. That was not our first need. Our first need is the need of a savior.
It sounds like Jesus exemplified in his life true faith in terms of his reliance on the Father.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And there's a reason why we need a substitute.
Yes.
Because no matter what we claim or try to do on earth, we just never achieve what Jesus achieved. It just seems we fall short.
And this brings me to something very important, which is at the root of what you're saying right there. And that is, we have to understand that Jesus Christ took the nature of Adam after the fall. He did not take the pre-fall nature. He was both like Adam and like us. Like us, he took the infirmities that we are subject to, the physical weaknesses, but like Adam, his nature did not have a taint of sin in it. Because remember, we're dealing with a savior here. Sin is not simply what I do. Sin is something that is inherent in me. Jesus had to bypass that. And Ellen G. White, bless her heart, she was a great theologian. She said he bypassed that leprosy of sin so that he could be our savior. So if we call that an advantage, it was an advantage absolutely for us, so he could be our savior.
Right. So I'm looking at the time, and I want us to wrap up. Two more quick questions. And I'm not going to give you the direct quote, but many who look to Jesus as having a sinful human nature, point to the fact that Ellen White suggests that God is waiting for the church to reach a certain point of perfection before he returns. How do you respond to those who interpret her statement to suggest that we need to reach some degree of sinless perfection before God returns?
Yeah, I will give the quote. It's some Christ Object Lessons,
right?
Page 69, and it says, Christ is waiting with longing desire for the manifestation of himself in his church.
Right.
When the character of Christ shall be perfectly reproduced in his people, then he will come to claim them as his own. And because this group has made so much of this, I remember writing an editorial on this, in which I went to the chapter in Christ Object Lessons and tried to look at what Ellen G. White was talking about. And to cut it short, what she was talking about was the character we should have, the quality we should have of helping people, ministering to people as Jesus ministered to them, loving them as Jesus loved them. This is what Ellen G. White is talking about. In terms of character, she says, character is not revealed by the occasional good deeds or occasional misdeeds, but by the trend of our lives, our habitual life and behavior. This is what determines character. So she's talking about discipleship. She's talking about how we minister to one another. And this is my lack, this is your lack. She's talking about what Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 25. I was in prison and you came to me. I was sick and you visited me. This kind of ministry, when the church gets to the place where it can minister as Jesus ministered, it can love as Jesus loved. This is the kind of church that Jesus is waiting for.
We can always continue to pray that the church reaches that point where
Amen.
we preach the gospel that
Amen.
God has called us to preach. Now, any closing thoughts are about the sanctuary or the nature of Christ that we did not cover that you think is important that you'd like to bring to our attention before we close?
Perhaps in regard to the sanctuary, I'm amazed and also distressed that as Adventists we do not realize what a gift, what a precious gift we have in the message of the sanctuary. I go back to how I felt about it in those early days as a Seventh-day Adventist. The sublime, the celestial nature of this teaching. I believe that if we understood correctly what the sanctuary is about, we would be shouting it from every rooftop instead of being ashamed of it. I wish we would compose songs about it. Sometimes I remember listening to a song that a couple of three evangelical ministers composed about the heavenly sanctuary, and I wish that Adventists had done that. We must see the sanctuary as something beautiful, something powerful, something assuring, that we have a high priest. That is how the book of Hebrews summarizes it. Of all the things we've been saying, this is the sum. We have a high priest who is there in the heavenly sanctuary, Jesus Christ. We can come to him boldly, present our wants, our needs, and everything that we have before him. He is our merciful high priest. There is great assurance in that. And as Adventists, we should be champions of assurance in Jesus Christ.
Amen. Dr. Adams, thank you so much for spending this time with us and for sharing your thoughts on both the sanctuary and the nature of Christ. I hope that this is not the first and only time that we will be able to meet and discuss these issues. You have such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure that this podcast will be a tremendous blessing to the hearers. God bless you, sir.
Thank you. I hope so, and thank God.
Okay.
Bye-bye.